So, the art of storytelling. I'm going to try my best to make this concise as possible, but I like to talk about this stuff. So, just a little disclaimer. Obviously, storytelling is an enormous topic, and to try to fit it into 20 or 30 minutes is pretty impossible. There's majors, careers, and whole lives built upon how to tell stories. So I'm just going to scratch the surface, and hopefully a little bit of what I talk about piques your guys' interest to maybe dig a little bit deeper, or maybe look into some of the stories you know, or like some of the stories we shared earlier, and understand why it was interesting. But yeah, I really wish I would have had more months to prepare for this, but I did my best with a couple of weeks. So first, kind of my game plan is I'm going to talk about why storytelling is important, kind of why it's effective in communication. I'm going to talk about what makes an epic story, kind of like what principles of storytelling you can kind of use to make a story either better or worse. And then I'm going to talk about how you can live a better story with the same principles of storytelling. So just my background, I'm going to give you a little bit of ethos. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I studied film at Point Loma. Essentially, this picture is me my senior year. I started as a graphic design major, and then I added filmmaking. So I didn't get into the introduction production class until I think my sophomore year. And the film that I made in my introduction class won best film of the whole school. And that was the first time that had happened while our sort of, the faculty the professor was in charge of the department was there. So that was pretty cool. And then I won one of the films that I produced or worked on, won best film every single year. And then I won best director of photography twice. And then that award in my left hand is kind of the best senior media communications person. So I did okay. That's just letting you know kind of my background and what I know about storytelling. So, my school was small, so it's not like too fantastic, but it's great. One thing when I was thinking about this part, and one thing that I noticed a lot when I studied script writing and studied production in college is that I remembered back into my elementary years, K through 12, and all that, and thought about all the times I had to write stories for English class and different projects. And I remember being so frustrated, what's going to make this story interesting? And I was thinking and never really understood, or never really, maybe the teachers talked about it, maybe they didn't. But it wasn't until some of my college level courses that I found out what makes a story interesting, and kind of the key. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So what is a story? This is kind of a cool little summary I got from a book. A story is a character who wants something that overcomes conflict to get it. And the key is conflict. That's why it's bolded. And that's kind of what was so interesting about Chris and Randy's story is they had conflict, right? They lost their keys. They had to drive 2.5 hours. They got back. There was more conflict. Then there was police, which was more conflict. Then there was an airsoft gun, and there was more conflict. And that's kind of what makes it interesting, right? And John's story had plenty of conflict. He was about to die, falling off a cliff. So that's kind of if you think of every story you've ever heard, conflict is kind of the core. This is a quote by William Archer. Drama is anticipation mingled with uncertainty. So that conflict is what makes us uncertain and makes us anticipate what's going to happen next. So some examples is Finding Nemo. So who's seen Finding Nemo? Everybody, good. I picked a good movie. So anyone care to guess what's the conflict in this story? Yeah, Marlin's looking for Nemo, right? So there's kind of there's kind of two conflicts. It's a little layered. There's a present conflict through most of the story where Dory is forgetting everything Marlin's telling him, or telling her, and she's helping him navigate the ocean. So we have this conflict of is Dory going to forget everything, and then Marlin's going to be stuck in the middle of the ocean? And then there's the this sort of global tension of, is he going to find Nemo in the vast expanse of the ocean? And what's interesting, I'll talk about this more later, but in the beginning, if you noticed, they sort of made you care about Nemo, or about Marlin and Nemo. Because we show Marlin's life in the beginning. They show how much he loved his mate, his wife. I don't know, clownfish have wife, but his mate and his kids, the little eggs. And then, if anyone remembers, a barracuda attacks and eats everything except for Nemo. So that's kind of why we feel his pain, is it's sort of this we empathize. I'll talk about that more later, because we've all lost something, right? So we've watched Marlin lose his family and all his kids, and that's why when he's searching for Nemo, that conflict is so great, because we now care about Marlin. So kind of the whole movie, you're locked into this tension. It's almost like this itch you can't scratch. You know, there's like, you're waiting to see if he's going to find Nemo. And it's funny how the movie will play with your emotions. I don't know if you guys watched it recently, but you'll notice that like there's parts where like Dory and Marlin are here, and then Nemo is like literally like crossing paths in the vast ocean. And you're like, ah! Or like all these things keep coming up with the sharks, you know, with the jellyfish. They almost die. You know, there's the fishnet at the end. He finally finds Nemo, and then he almost gets taken away. So it's the same thing that worked with Randy and Chris's story. They just keep feeding off that conflict and keeping you hooked. So once I kind of understood this conflict thing, I was able to sort of think through stories or I was able to think of interesting stories on the spot. I could think of old stories I had and make them interesting. Or I could watch any story on TV and be like, that's why it's interesting. So to give you guys an illustration, I'm going to play and show you the power of storytelling on your emotions.
How easy it is for us to forget what it was like when we were once family. The times we shared. How easy it is for us to forget how to love.
Abba, 食飯啦。
嚟食飯。
How easy it is for us to forget how to smile. It's easy to forget.
阿爸，你做咩啊？阿爸，
仔，一步一步嚟，你一定得嘅。
But it's even harder not to love.
爸妈。
阿爸阿媽食飯。
仔，食飯。
Family is forever.
Who would say they were emotionally moved by that video? Anyone want to admit to crying? You know, I had some trouble getting through it, even the second time watching it, or the third time, whatever that was. But yeah, that's just to give you guys an illustration of how much emotion a good story can elicit and can bring out in you, and kind of the power of being a good storyteller and what you can bring out in others. So it's kind of funny because, you know, once you understand it, you can watch the video and be like, oh, they're playing me with that scene. And you're like, oh, I see what they're doing with that scene. And it's fun once you understand it. But why is it important to be able to tell a good story? Anyone want to try and answer that? Why would it be helpful if you're not a filmmaker like I plan to be?
I think life is just a performance, and your audience wants to be interested in what you're talking about, so might as well tell a good story if you're going to tell one.
Yeah. Communication. Anyone else have any ideas?
Kind of makes you reflect it makes you kind of reflect on problems that you don't even realize you have with your life.
Yeah. More like self-assessment, kind of self-reflection. One of the big things is that it's one of the most powerful forms of communication and persuasion. So communication obviously is important when talking to friends. Like if you want to make friends, if you want people to be interested in you, and you can tell an interesting story about yourself, you can communicate effectively, grab their attention. They're going to want to be your friend, right? If you're in a profession and you're in a job interview, they're just asking questions to figure out who you are. They want to know, who is this person in front of me? And if you can tell stories that illustrate who you are, you're going to be much more attractive to the employer, right? Selling yourself and selling ideas, that was an advertisement, right? I'm going to show you some other videos that are advertisements. They really, really use your emotions in advertising because emotions cause you to make decisions. So if you want to tell someone and share an idea with them, convince them of persuade in some form or another, story is really important, as well as in leadership. You know, people will follow an idea, follow a concept, follow a story. So stories, their power comes from the appeal to our emotions. This is called pathos. If you heard me mention ethos earlier, if any of you have studied this in class, Aristotle has these three methods of persuasion. There's ethos, which is about source and credibility, dealing with the speaker, author's authority. So that's why I was giving you information about my accomplishments. I was creating ethos. Then logos is sort of the logic to support your claim through induction or deduction, but it's a lot of the stats and facts. I'll be talking about those a little bit more. But then the pathos, it's actually Greek for suffering or experience. And what it is it's appealing to the audience's sympathies and their imagination. An appeal to pathos causes the audience not just to respond emotionally, but to actually identify with the writer or the character's point of view. So you feel, you sense. That's what the suffering comes from. You're sort of suffering through their emotions. In that video, you were suffering through the dad's frustration and the guilt he was feeling for turning his son away and his son getting injured, right? You were suffering through that whole, you know, the son losing his legs and not being able to walk. That's so frustrating. And you're almost feeling the pain imaginatively. And if you think of Finding Nemo, right? Like you're suffering with Marlin. He loses his family. He's finding Nemo. He's searching all over the ocean to try to find him. You're feeling the guilt that Nemo has because he went out and touched the butt or the boat, right? And then now he feels responsible and lost in the vast ocean without the safety of his father. That's what hooks you in, that sympathy, that empathy. So what's interesting about the persuasion power of pathos is like 2 weeks ago, if you were in the leadership seminar that I did, I talked about, or it was 3 weeks ago, sorry. I talked about the golden circle from that TED Talk, and it was like talking about the why before the how. And he explained that the reason that people do things and understanding their why is how you emotionally connect to someone. And he talked about how the part of your brain that controls emotions is called the limbic part of your brains. There's one part of your brain called the neocortex, and it deals with data and information. And then the limbic brain deals with emotions and also decision making, but also doesn't have any room for language. So it's really interesting because if you are emotionally tied into a story, that's what part of the brain decides what you're going to do and takes action. So if you want to bring about action, you want to speak to someone's emotions, and that's why pathos is powerful. It's the element of the story that speaks to emotions. And then what's really interesting about stories is that people put themselves into the story. I'll talk about it in a second, what it's called, but people actually experience the story themselves. Obviously, if you're crying over some flickering light on the screen, there's something else going on there, right? And what's interesting is if you're talking about persuasion, there's a concept in sales that everything I say to you is suspect, right? Because you don't necessarily trust me. I'm just some person talking in front of the audience. Everything like a close friend or a trusted person says, like 50% of that is suspect. And then you may trust 50% of it. But 100% of what you think and say and do is absolute truth. So, if in a story a viewer puts themselves in the story and they go through the experiences and make their own conclusions, then everything that you've just shown them is absolute truth, right? Because it's their conclusions. It's not you telling them to think a certain way. They came to that conclusion by reliving the story of the character you just told them. So the power is this suspended disbelief. It's how you suspend your disbelief. So obviously, a lot of you have probably watched movies and like, that's just a CGI character. That's just lines that he rehearsed to tell her. He's not in love. They're just actors. That's if you had your guard up and you had that disbelief. But the reason movies work is we suspend our disbelief. It's almost like human nature that we don't realize that we sort of forget that it's fake to just experience it. So if you slide a person into an fMRI machine and watch their brain while they watch a story, the brain doesn't look like the spectator. The brain actually looks like it's experiencing the story, right? If the actor is angry on screen, the viewer's brain shows the same signs as anger. If the story is sad, the person's brain shows sad. And that's why audiences in horror films will cringe, they'll scream, you'll ball up. That's to protect your vital organs. If you didn't know why you ball up, that's just human nature to protect your vitals. And that's why your heart is racing. And when a hero, is in danger, when John was sliding down the hill, right? And that's why, we'll weep over Old Yeller, who's some pretend pet, and he dies within the movie, and you're like, and stories will powerfully hook the audience attention because at the brain level, it's like the story is happening to us, right? Stories also help you focus. This is really interesting. Who daydreams here? Right? Studies actually show that the human mind is a wanderer by nature, and daydream is your default state. So whenever the mind doesn't have something really important to do, it gets bored and wanders off into la la land. So studies show that about half of your waking hours, or 1/3 of your whole lifetime, is spent spinning fantasies. You have about 2,000 daydreams a day, and the average duration is about 14 seconds. But when you're engaged in the story, like watching Breaking Bad, or reading Harry Potter, or Hunger Games, you have 0 daydreams per hour, and you can stay focused for hours on end. That's why me and Eric, we watched Interstellar, and I thought I time traveled, because it's a 3-hour movie. And I didn't know that when I walked in. I walked in at 9:45, and we left at like 1 in the morning. And I was like, whoa! I was like, where did that time go? It's because I was locked in, 100% focused for the whole story. So it means that stories act like a drug that lulls us into an altered state of consciousness, which is really interesting. I like that quote. And some examples of kind of how this works is like in leadership, you can't tell someone, Lance, be more creative, right? Just work harder, you know? Love your job, be happy. But if like you tell someone to follow the rules, like no one reads the rule book. But if you tell a story about someone who broke the rules, you've probably had that happen in any sort of leadership position you've been in. Someone's told you a story of like what's wrong, and then you didn't want to do that, right? That's kind of the power of it. Actually, an interesting thing is psychologists, you might take a group of people and then put them in a lab and tell them all the reasons not to discriminate against homosexuals, and you won't make much progress. Because if people think differently, they'll have their guard up. They'll be skeptical, critical, and they'll walk out of the lab without really more tolerant views at all. They'll have the same views. But if they watch TV shows like Will and Grace, that treats homosexuality in non-judgmental ways, or if we start empathizing with characters like in Ellen, obviously Ellen, Modern Family, 6 Feet Under, Glee, you can get sort of this driver for massive social change. And in the last 15 years or so, we've had a much liberal view of homosexuality, and social sciences attribute that to TV for some of the credit. But yeah, interestingly enough too, this neurochemist, Paul Zak, he studied brain levels, and he paid subjects $20 for this study. And then he took a blood test before it, and then he showed some sad, compelling story about a father and a terminally ill son, kind of similar to what we watched. And then he took blood samples afterwards, and the blood had a spike of oxytocin. That's the neurochemical that deals with empathy and caring for others. So, and at the end of the study, he actually asked for them to donate to a charitable organization that was helping with the problem that they saw in the video. And these students that he, most students are not full of, not wealthy by any means. They, on average, donated about half their pay to the organization, which is interesting. So that's kind of the power of being able to tell a good story. So here is an interesting story.
Happy birthday to you.
Make a wish.
Granny!
Hello.
Have you done your homework?
Ada!
For a general strike.
Ready or not?
Here it comes.
Violent clashes with live ammunition against.
Deserve to get shot.
Have a nice day, Mum.
Airstrikes on rebel position.
We are going to stay.
What's happening?
Go.
Heavy fighting in Richmond.
Where are we?
Rebel forces advance.
Happy birthday to you. Make a wish, darling.
So what's awesome about that is it's talking about what's happening in Syria, and it's making it real to the Western world. By if this happened to your kids, that's what it look like. That's what it would look like. So unless you guys were counting the seconds, that was a minute that you just experienced right there. It's a short, well, it was like either a minute or 2 minutes. And the first video was 3 minutes. So there's a lot that can happen by watching how characters react. So I want to give you some quick elements of story, so some more practical things. I'll probably breeze through this because we're low on time. But you've got a protagonist, that's the main character. And it doesn't have to be someone who's perfect, but someone people can empathize with. So like Nemo, he had a little flipper. So everyone felt sorry for little Nemo, right? And the protagonist struggles with identifiable human flaws. And the main good stories, they confront a strong moral choice. And they struggle with their flaws to overcome that. So there needs to be a real conflict, and they need to face their greatest fears. John was going to die. His story was very interesting. Randy and Chris almost got arrested, for breaking into a car with a gun in the back, right? But what's interesting is our greatest fears tend to deal with relationships, dealing with things with like forgiveness, risking rejection, and learning to love. Strangely enough, we don't confront near-death experiences every day. So most of our greatest fears deal with relationships. And a lot of times we think that interesting stories are about like making money and being successful and getting security, but that's not interesting at all. If someone, wanted a Volvo, like I said in the beginning, a story is a character who wants something that overcomes conflict to get it. They just want this Volvo, and the whole time they just work, and at the end they buy the Volvo. You're not going to cry when they drive off the car lot, because there was no conflict. There was nothing to fight. There was no moral thing they had to deal with. There's this other concept that we could take a long time getting into, but called saving the cat. And it's a script writing term for having the protagonist do something that makes you see that they have a heart. Like if they saved a cat out of a tree. Oh, that person's a good person. I care about what happens to them, right? So it's things like with Finding Nemo, Marlin was doing great things in the beginning. He was a nice person, a nice fish, right? All sorts of movies, like if you watch one of the new Rocky movies, they spend the first 20 minutes of the movie showing Rocky doing good things to the community. Because that's why it matters at the end when he wins his fight, is now you care about Rocky. But then there's an antagonist. That's like the force of evil, or the bad guy. And then there's a character, so that's kind of typically the moral, or sort of the conflict deals with a specific character. Sort of the moral conflict is personified by someone in most stories. And then there's a character arc that deals with character development. So the real point of the story, the real thing that gets you hooked, is watching the transformation of a character through the moral dilemma. So you're watching that girl and watching her from one birthday to the next birthday, and how she transformed through this moral dilemma of her city being bombed, right? Watching how Marlin overcomes all these obstacles in the great vast ocean to save his son, and how they deal with those challenges. And then how you build a character is showing versus telling. So with that short 1-minute Save the Children video, they didn't tell us anything about that character, right? It was so powerful because they showed it. They showed her emotions, showed her reactions to what's happening. As storytellers, we're tempted to tell the audience what the person is thinking. The first video, they cheated a little bit and they had a narrator. But that's partly because it was different language and partly because they only had 3 minutes to tell the story. But, people want to work for their meal. Like a viewer wants to work to understand it. That's why I loved Interstellar, because I was sitting there trying to figure it out. What's going on, And we're drawn into stories, especially the most powerful thing is not having any dialogue. Like that girl, we're trying to figure out what's happening. What's going on around her? What are these bombs? That's what draws us in. And then it was interesting, one of the things I watched, it explained that this is why we're so interested in infants and puppies. Because we're wondering, what are they thinking, right? What is going on? So I have this funny little video here.
Come on.
It's called Puppies versus Stairs. Come on. So that's the clear protagonist, and the antagonist is the staircase. And there's a moral dilemma that they want to get to their owner, get to their caretaker, get outside. There's one that there's a bone outside and the puppy's trying to get it. And see the conflict that they're dealing with? The obstacles they have to overcome. But yeah, that's what hooks us in. Is the challenge of this puppy trying to get up these steps.
That who you are. It's your character that's from the skies. Strength comes from the heart.
Yeah.
And it's what you need when you fight your wars.
So there's a little bone he wants to get to. But yeah, I showed you guys that as sort of a fun illustration of like, that's why it works. And that's why you get hooked on these little internet videos. But yeah, the protagonists, obviously the puppies. And what's interesting is a character is defined by what they do, not what they feel or wish for. So characters are built through actions and not thoughts. And what they think means very little, because you don't really know what they think. You just see how they react. And the true nature of a character is displayed by their actions. So every story has a problem that they're overcoming. And they're always about trouble. Stories aren't about people having good days. They're about people having the worst days of their life. And you're watching this person overcome this. And you're watching their actions. You know, actions speak louder than words. And yeah, it's kind of like this question that you're asking yourself. At the heart of their humanity, the character's humanity, what are you going to find? Are they going to be strong or weak, honest or dishonest? Here's a quote from Robert McKee. The only way you know the truth is to watch him make choices under pressure, to take one action or another in the pursuit of his desire. So a character, or a story is a character who wants something, has to overcome conflict to get it. So living a better story. This is kind of the conclusion part. It's interesting because the same elements that make a good story make a good life. The same way that a writer develops his character by having him overcome conflict to reach their goal, you develop character by overcome conflict to reach your goal. I like how they're the same word, right? Oh, John's got good character. How did he develop that? He almost slipped off a cliff. Right? Stories are also about great scenes. Like in Rocky, here's an illustration. You have plenty of meaningful conversations in coffee shops, but you don't really remember these meaningful conversations in coffee shops because they're coffee shops. Oh, there's nothing interesting about a coffee shop. In Rocky, he trains for the boxing match in a meat locker, punching meat. How outrageous is that? But it's a great scene, right? So if you want to live a better story with your life, find some great scenes. Go on adventures, climb mountains like John did. You know, go to, what do you do, Six Flags snowboarding in the same day? Like, that's a great scene. And that was interesting. Like, Audrey being behind Obama. Like, that's a great scene. You can't really plan that one. But that's kind of how you can start living a more interesting life. Also, you need an inciting incident. This is a term used in script writing for something that happens to the character that forces them to move. Because we're drawn to comfort, and we don't want to overcome the conflict. So every protagonist in a movie will have something like the death of someone, or someone gets abducted, right, that causes them to move. So I already talked about building your character. But what makes a story epic? So if you're like, how can I make my story not just a good story, but an epic story? There's two elements, two key principles. The thing that the character wants must be very difficult to attain. The more difficult, the better, because there's more risk. And the risk makes it more interesting for the audience. And the greatest stories are the ones which a character's very life is at stake. You guys think through like your favorite movies. Most of the time, the character has a huge life-risking obstacle. And the second thing is the ambition has to be sacrificial. And the protagonist has to be going through that risk for the sake of someone else. So if this guy's going through all this risk just to buy himself a new Volvo, who cares, right? But if Marlin is risking his life going through this sea of jellyfish and almost getting poisoned to death. It made it look like electrocution, but jellyfish poisoned you. To save his son, then that's meaningful. So I think it's pretty simple to see how we can apply that to our lives. Try to find something in which we desire, right? And we desire a lot. That's a big deal. That is also self-sacrificing. And it doesn't matter how much conflict it is, because the more scared you are about attaining it, the better and the more interesting it's going to be. Because you can live your life safely, but no one tells stories about the safe grandpa who got his 401k, and saved up all life, and then now he's retiring. That's not the interesting grandpa, right? It's the World War veteran who almost died and jumped on a grenade or something, right? So as you guys go forth from this, think about how you can make your stories more interesting. I kind of ran out of time. If you guys want to hang out for some discussion questions, feel free. You guys are able to go because it's 8. But I do have a couple questions I guys want you to think about. I would say get in groups of 3, and there's going to be a group of 2, and talk about essentially like what are things that you could do that would make your life more interesting. Talk about what are some fears that would add conflict to your story, right? Everyone has something they've been wanting to do, but they're like, I don't know about that, Maybe a profession you wanted to get into, but you weren't sure. Or your dad said, oh, you're not going to make money doing that, right? And just talk about kind of what stood out to you about the stories. So break up, talk, have fun.